Hey, thanks for coming. This is a new format that I'm going to be doing where I give the stage off to community members to talk about their knowledge and experience when it comes to specific subjects. If you want to do the same, just hit me up on Discord and we can set up a time for you to make a presentation. I'm going to hand it off to Cougar and Sonar to talk about aircraft modeling in hard surface. I know the video can be a little bit long, so at least be sure to leave a comment and a like to let me know what you think about this and how we can improve. I'll leave it off to them. Bye.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having us. Apparently Sonar can't hear you. Whatever, that's okay. Or Obi. Anyways, thank you guys for coming. Here, I'm going to post a link for the stream that I'm streaming in the chat for this video. Oh, it's not live. Oops. Sorry. Here, I'm gonna start streaming so everybody can see what I've recently been working on. I'm gonna run through a quick background of how I started 3D modeling and my experiences with Blender because I'm not the usual suspect when it comes to Blender. I didn't just hop in and go, oh, time to do the donut tutorial. I had some prior experience, so you can say I cheated a little bit. Let me solve this issue really quick with the stream though. There we go.
I love presentations and all the weird technical things that go with it.
Sorry guys, I was up till 6 a.m. trying to figure this shit out and I thought I had it, but I guess not. That's unfortunate. Here, I'm going to post the link right here in the VC. That is not a Su-35, although I will be showing you guys a Su-35. This is an F-18F Super Hornet Block 2. The lot really doesn't matter because I have not finished the cockpit. This is, by the way, this model is still a work in progress. As you can see here from the front gear, I still have to set this track up. It's a little odd just from the way things are being set up. You're not good with planes? Dude, that's fine. If you're good with Blender or you're good with planes or just a chill dude, I get along with you guys really well. So I take a sip of my coffee and then I'll get into my background. I'm going to make a quick check. Obi, can you hear me? Hello, Obi Dobi? Oh, wait. He's in the audience.
I thought I moved him up.
You did, but he went back down. Anyways, doesn't matter.
I blame Discord.
Probably a Discord problem. But we'll give them the benefit of the doubt, and we'll tell them that it's a technical difficulty on our end. Sweet. I'm going to pull up a project really quick whilst I go over my background. So I used to work for a block studio type deal where we would just make Roblox games, and I was the animator, and they pretty much taught me everything I knew for the time being when I was there, and I was pretty young. And then that's kind of how I started rolling with Blender, but I wasn't super eager and I wasn't learning really as fast because I didn't have a drive to do it. I was only getting a little bit of money and I was just making general use animations for simple rigs. It didn't really look awesome and all that, but anyways, we love to play this game called VTOL VR. My friends, a few friends, I don't know if you guys have ever heard it. Same with another few flight sims like Microsoft Flight Sim and DCS World. We were playing those games, and then we were thinking, gosh, these could be improved so much if you could just combine the two. So one day my programming friend was like, hey, I can program. I'm pretty sure you can Blender. Do you want to make a game? And I was like, hell yeah. So I'll show you guys the second creation I've ever made for him. So this is when I started to learn Blender. This is all essentially my first model. Take in mind, though, that I did have experience prior. So this thing was supposed to be the same thing I was just showing you, the F-18F. Pretty bad. At least I had the cockpit, though. Not too awful. Definitely could use some improvements. Let me show you guys the topology. It is horrendous. I don't know what I was thinking, but that's pretty much where I started. And I just kept pushing myself, doing harder and harder tasks. I made a Su-35 Tiara variant, which is, like, no kidding. I was so proud of this model too, and I'm going to look up Bernoulli's principle. I'm pretty sure is what it is. Oh no, it's not that. There's a graph that I love to reference. So it is, I can't remember exactly what the phenomenon was called, but it is time bent or potence down here and confidence up here. So this is called the peak of Mount Stupid. That's where I was. Overconfident, didn't really know too much, but I thought I knew, but I really didn't. And the Dunning-Kruger effect, that's exactly it. Thanks, dude. I was at the peak of the Dunning-Kruger effect of Mount Stupid. That was a pretty funny time. Let me show you my second project as well. Pull it up here. I made a file and everything for it, but I'm going to struggle to find it anyway. Here we go. So this was like my second asset. You can see huge improvement. Still, the topology is not amazing. Definitely better, but yikes, there's some weirdness going on here. This is bad topology, by the way. If you're just joining a stream, don't use this stuff for reference. I still consider myself learning. Although I do have experience, I'm still learning all the time. Just awesome. Yeah, if you guys want to ask questions, feel free to ask questions whilst I'm talking, just so I could get some that I could read down from a list, because I'm pretty sure I can answer them fairly quick. But what's the oldest plane I made? Do you mean the oldest version, the oldest design of plane, or literally the oldest plane I've made? The oldest design of plane? Probably a T1 Hawk. I used to know an RAF pilot, and he used to be a fighter pilot. He used to fly the Tornado. He's a really cool dude. I did not finish this one, as you can see, obviously. I'll keep the topology on screen now. This is one I was working on. This is just the basics. It was pretty neat. I did like it a lot. I enjoyed this project, but this is probably the oldest aircraft that I've ever made. I do, however, plan to make ones that are significantly older. If I'm not mistaken, I'm fairly certain the T1 Hawk. The air intake is similar to the Phantom, yes, although the Phantom's does extend quite a bit like that. A little weird. Still pretty cool, though. I'm going to be talking in aviation nerd. I don't know if you guys speak that, but for the ones who just speak Blender, feel free to ask questions too, because some of this stuff will go right past you, and I wouldn't expect anything better. When I first was learning aviation, I messed with people like this, Obi Dopi Kenobi or Sonar, and damn, he was past me. There he is. Can you hear me? Awesome.
Sorry, I was
Sweet.
slow at picking you up.
So let me introduce Sonar as well. Sonar, he is one of the, you can consider him a student of mine. I taught him how to model for Blender, although he did have prior experience making craft liveries, things like that. Obi, you could show them your F-16 if you would like.
I have permission to share screen, but
that's okay. I could probably show it. He is working on the F-16, so we're simultaneously working on two different projects. I'm working on the Super Hornet. He's working on the F-16 Victor Block 70. I'm fairly certain of Victor. I think we're uncertain on that. If you guys know any more information about the F-16, though, feel free to DM me, because we're trying to learn all about that stuff. And information on that is very scarce for some reason. Here, let me pull up the file. Sorry. My brain struggles to multitask.
I sent the most recent one to you.
Here's an older version without the cockpit modeled. Let me get rid of the reference images. There we go. This thing is pretty neat. You were pretty proud of this. This is like your first model, or one of your first.
1.5, I would consider.
So he still has some to learn. I still have a lot to learn. But he is actually, it's not very bad on this one. It's actually pretty dang good. This is basically where he started, because I've coached him. And if you're interested in aviation and you're a cool dude, you can feel free to DM me as well. And I would totally be down to hang out in the Blender Discord and hang out in this Discord and help you guys out. What plane budget you give yourself for the models? Or poly budget? That's a really good question. So for our game, we're making a game called TAC, the Tactics Virtual is what it stands for. I take reference from Falcon BMS a little bit, and I've noticed that I haven't taken any of their models, but I was told by one of the guys on the team that they would stick around 300,000 tries per model or lower if they could. 300,000 was probably around the max. That is a much older engine, though. I don't blame him for having to cope with that, because it is a pain to get any of the BMS stuff to be working properly. Here, I'll put this on a still. You could read the questions as they come, sure. Do I make a naval warship game with warships? Or do I know how to make a naval warship game? So let you guys know that I'm not a programmer, although I'm in touch with programmers and I do get some cool insider information. And I can tell you guys, I'm not a programmer myself. So sometimes take my advice, or not my advice, my words about games and programming with a little bit of salt. Because plenty of 3D modelers do this.
We're all learning.
Well, 3D modelers going, this is definitely happening in the game, and this is coming out in this. And then it's like, oh yeah, that actually never happened, and we did something completely different. So games often go in that direction, and we're very new. You can feel free to join my Discord too. It's in my profile. I got a link right there. Or from the stream. It is in the description. What's up, Spawn? The landing gear is gorgeous. Thank you, dude. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, awesome. There it is in the chat. Is the main landing gear movable? Yes, it is, and I can show you. So let me show you a couple neat things that make this thing work. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to move it, and then you guys will get to see it. So this thing, I was going to rig the other stuff with bones. My model is a little unique in the fact that we are using a system on Unity called, actually I won't disclose it, but you might be able to figure it out. So the system that we're using has a weird workaround that will not let us use, sorry, this is just a safety pin. It's not supposed to be parented. So the system that we're using does not allow us to use bones yet. They will add bone support. So for the majority of this stuff, like the horizontal stabilizers, these do rotate on an axis. And yes, if you're wondering why is it rotating off the z-axis, it was intentional. The Unity was being weird with the x-axis rotations. I'm not sure exactly why that was happening in Unity, but all I did was I changed the origin, so they did used to rotate off the x.
You allow those to rotate by just placing the origin where it needs to be?
Yes, exactly. So these ones, the origin is like way down in the middle of nowhere, so it rotates. And there's a couple cool tricks and methods. I will post a time lapse of me making this in the future when it's fully complete. I'm gonna say it probably won't be the best time lapse because there are frequent times I forget to record. Basically all the times I open Blender. But there's a couple neat tricks. I actually took a cube and I orientated the cube and I would rotate it, and there's a whole bunch of other neat things. So if you guys get into modeling or to hard surface or aircraft modeling, you're not going to be looking for these tips, but then after you have a little bit of experience, you're going to get it. It's going to click in your mind.
Do you use any hard surface add-ons or tools?
I do.
And if so, are they worth it?
Yes, very much. So I use loop tools. I did get quad remesher, although it is some neat tool to work around, and it seems very neat. For what I do, for the most part, it's not really what I like to use, mainly because I believe it was designed for soft body modeling primarily, because it does not keep hard edges very well. It doesn't keep hard surface models like how they're modeled. Take that with a grain of salt. I'm not extremely experienced with quad remesher. I got this pretty recently, so it is possibly my error. I do use the screen keys, and let me pull it up now. There we go. Screen keys are worth it. So this Blender kit is actually, I hardly ever use it, but I do use it for textures because I am not a texture artist myself. Although I made some small things, I like to make renders, and you can see with a couple of the renders that I have like cool rubber texture for the tires. I didn't make that. I did make the model, however. I just like to add that because it gives it a little bit of character. Makes it look neat. There was another add-on. I will pull it up here. Whoops, my preferences. So I use loop tools. Loop tools is pretty dang nice. Extra objects, those are all great.
Are there any hard surface specific?
No, not really.
Box cutter or anything?
Actually, I don't think I have box cutter. I wanted to get it, but I don't have box cutter. If I were you guys and I were to get add-ons, look for cable add-ons, and like they mess with cables, because I did manage to set this up without any add-ons. I set up all these cables without any add-ons. It would have made my life a bit easier with add-ons.
So a lot of this is raw Blender minus the loop tools.
I do like to use loop tools a lot, but the rest of it is basically stock Blender. I didn't need any add-ons. Have I ever made explosion effects? I know how to make an explosion effect. I've seen it many times in Blender. However, I've never made one and tried to export it for the render engine. We'd probably be using something. I don't know if we'd be using EmberGen. Unsure if it works for Unity, but we'd probably be using something like that. So for making the explosion effects, definitely there are plenty of tutorials on YouTube, so feel free to look that up. But personally, I don't have any to show you, unfortunately.
So how do you get objects to rotate off-grid axis?
Oh, okay. So I have my selection up here to global, so this is a personal thing too. I'll grab the whole aircraft. Some things are not parented. Take in mind that this is not finished, but when I rotate it, I'm going to press X. It did not just show me pressing X on my keyboard. That's pretty weird. Anyways, I'm pressing X to rotate it, and then for this, I press X to rotate it, and then if I press X again, it swaps to local rotations. So I use the local rotations a lot when I model. It's kind of weird that it's not showing it to me on here. But yeah, I use a lot of the local rotations, and I do keep separate objects, and then I will join them later on. I will show you the first versions of this Hornet. I think it's number 5. This is pretty good. So you can see this model was put together. This is when I started to get basic topology. I was using these mark seams, not to texture, but to mark for myself, so I knew what was going where. Another thing that really helped me along the way is a notebook. If you do any hard surface modeling, I highly, highly, highly recommend a notebook because I would just write whatever in my brain, and it made it significantly easier when I would hop into Blender and do stuff. It actually decreased my fatigue when I had long modeling sessions because when I draw it and write down a list of things that I wanted to make, I made things much more streamlined when I was already in Blender. I wasn't having to struggle to figure out what the hell I'm doing. It was already conceived in my brain. I had already tried to partially reconstruct it mechanically, trying to make a blueprint. I just like drawing and pretty neat stuff in there, and I use it for reference occasionally. But here's one of the first versions of the Hornet that I was just showing you guys. I'm showing you this because, like I said, I start with different objects, and then I'll join them together. So like this fuselage, you could probably imagine this was a cylinder that just went down. The lurxes, or the leading edge root extensions, these things that I'm circling right here, those were a separate object as well, and the engines were actually made off of the cylinder, and then I had slowly moved it to the front, and I used some pretty neat references that you can see here. And I did get, if you do DM me, I will give you references for Super Hornet if you want to make one. I do have some pretty good references. I have some pretty awesome references for the landing gear too. And for people who are getting into hard surface modeling that are making a lot of objects like this, something pretty complicated, look into making collections. They make your life a lot easier. Something that I didn't do when I was relatively new. There we go. And so I got a wing foil shape and name stuff. Vent is spot on with that one. Yeah, so this reference,
you're going to have hundreds of objects. You don't want to get confused.
Yes, I have how many objects? 538 objects. So yeah, it pays off to name it. Usually I'll actually make something like the 999. Yes, I will go back and rename objects. I'll go back and figure out what I'm renaming. So I try and name it stuff that's shortened, but not too shortened. There's kind of a sweet spot for it. But whatever works for you, best thing is to just start doing it so you have experience doing it. Most of you probably know that you should already do that, but I'm just saying it for the people who don't. Anyways, what should I get on about next? Let me hide my reference.
So how do you put the curves on the surface of the plane? How do you go about that?
The curves? So this curve is a really good example from right here. I saw this in some reference images. This thing is not perfectly one-to-one with a real Super Hornet. Maybe if you're a mechanic or something, you can see some weird small differences. If you do, please feel free to DM me. I would love to fix it if I could. But this curve, I actually started using the knife tool with K, and I actually drew out the curve. And then later on, I went in and fixed the topology, like here. The hardest parts I probably had of topology were probably the gear doors and this stuff.
So you just manually move it into shape. to form that curve?
I manually use the knife tool, and then I do use the relax a lot for the loop tools. So if you can see here, relax, I use that a lot with some of my stuff. Very useful tool. Smoothens sharp corners and things like that. How do you approach small details like a little hole on the body or a bump on the wing or a screw in the window seal? So this is a really good question. A lot of modelers actually love to go too in depth with their model. I would say for every tiny screw, every little thing, you don't actually have to do that as a 3D modeler. Usually, if you have a texture artist that will make a roughness map, they can actually they can make rivet holes, screws, bumps, weird marks on the wings. If you've ever seen the, let's look up a Spitfire wing. If you've ever seen like the curves, if you ever play War Thunder, there are some really neat curves that are in between the wings, just where the support structure is, like bumps like these.
Basin.
And they kind of like dip a little bit. As a modeler, personally, I wouldn't model that, mainly for performance reasons. Using a height map saves on performance rather than adding an additional 20,000 tries to try and get even one wing with that amount of detail. And I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but in the War Thunder models, they do the exact same thing. That's one of the reasons it runs so good, is they do exactly that same tactic where they don't model every little rivet and screw. They model something like this, and then somebody will go back and model every screw, every little thing. These details, so I looked up loads of references for this, and I would highly recommend hanging out in this Blender Discord. That's pretty much what I did. Not in this Discord, but I did hang out in a different one. I will be hanging out in this one a lot more, though. I managed to get into contact with some Super Hornet mechanics.
Really cooler Discord.
Yes. I was asking him how these systems worked, and understanding how it works helps significantly. Even though you're not trying to make it or recreate it to work exactly like the real thing, it does help modeling it, like the full understanding. This landing gear is a prime example of that stuff. I still don't understand exactly how the shock mounts. Shock mount looks a little basic compared to the rest of it, I'd say. But we'll have a texture artist go back, and he'll actually add detail and like something that looks like a ball bearing. Just to say, my performance cylinders are the worst for tri counts. If you guys have any experience in Blender, you should know that they are the worst for tri counts. Ooh, let me show you guys something neat that just popped in my mind. Field probe. Okay, so this thing.
To cover a little bit on that, essentially the detail is required for what the project is for. So since this is going into a game engine, you don't want that much detail on the model, but detail on the texture.
Yes, if I was going to use this for an anime or a movie type thing, or let's say I went crazy, I was going to make Top Gun again, or I was going to make Top Gun and remake it or whatever, I would model all of that stuff, and I would have an insanely high try count. Doesn't mean that you can not optimize when you're still making models for renders and things, because it does help your rendering speeds a little bit. But personally, I would spare no expense. For your computer should spare no expense for making neat stuff like that. This is a good example of where I was optimizing, was all of these cables. I don't know if you can actually notice, it's hard to tell, but when you look at them, they're actually just squares. And I could probably get away with making triangles too, like this, and it would actually be very hard to tell if that's a triangle. It's a bit easier to tell on that one. This is hard to tell it's a cylinder or a square. It gives a really good illusion of being a cylinder because of the shade smooth modifier. But yeah, the small places where you can optimize. I made the field probe completely separate from the aircraft itself, mainly because for our game, think ahead for the programmer's sake. How can I make it easy for him? They do the same thing with you. It may not seem like it, but they do. For me, I was thinking ahead, and I was like, okay, so when you are just flying normally and you don't have your field probe out and you're not doing a refueling, that's just a lot of useless stuff being rendered. So I made it all in a different collection, in a different group, so he could make that de-render when it's stowed away, which is, I think, is pretty neat. It's a pretty good way of working around some weird performance things. I'll say it again, I am working on a game, so this kind of stuff is what I'm constantly thinking about, is usually performance. I'm going to bounce back on what somebody said of what's a try count, a max try count. I'm aiming for about no more than 300,000, but I'm not saying that you can't exceed 300,000. If you're making a flight sim DCS, I was just in contact with one of the guys who was working on the Superbug, the F-18F Super Hornet. He was making a Superbug mod, and the cockpit had over 1 million tries on its own. And that wasn't with the plane or anything. That was just the cockpit. So yeah, you guys can see how it gets out of hand really quick. They get into this mindset of it needs to be ultra detailed, where I would argue it doesn't need to be. The primary thing is it needs to convince the player that it is high detail and that it is a real aircraft. That's what you're trying to do. Just give them the illusion of being immersed.
So, what's your beginning process when it comes to just starting off a plane?
My beginning process?
As you said, you do notes and that kind of thing.
Actually, I use my notebook when I've already made like basic outline or something. I usually start writing in my notebook after I've already found references to help me understand it, but usually my time is spent on Google initially. I will look up things like jet name here, schematic or profile or references, and with enough digging, I'm confident that you can find many, many, many references that are buried within Google search. That's usually where I start, and I gather a couple good references. So I usually start with a side profile, top profile, and a front profile. Depending on what you're making, let's say if I was going to make a YF-23, gorgeous plane by the way, I would start with a rear profile as well, because look at how unique that shape is. It'd be really weird to make with only a front profile. You can imagine how I get no clue how any of this works. So having a rear profile would help significantly. The more references, the better usually. And then you could split them into different groups like this thing. This is a great reference. I'll actually cross-reference full images too, because not all of them are perfect. You can see here with the F-18 model that I have here. Actually, I'll show you a model that I was working on. I used multiple
I imagine
references.
A lot of the blueprints you find are just essentially fan-made, and
usually that gear one, I'm pretty sure was a real one. The gear schematic I had, but that was a very uncommon find. So I lost my train of thought. I think Sonar. Do you want to talk for a moment? I'm kind of yapping it up over here.
Well, so he was talking about how his approach would apply to craft and all this stuff, but really, if you think about it, all these fundamentals that he's talking about apply to anything in Blender. They all have a similar approach to how you could start off. If you're trying to model a battleship, you want to look at the big details. And well, what is the biggest thing that I notice on a battleship, right? The entire hull. I can start off with that, the bottom finished, and then work up on the island. But all the stuff he's been talking about can apply to whatever you're working on. And so,
very true. It's
also important not to wear yourself out, because I've done this to myself already. And so, even if you do have a lot of excitement and you really want to work on a model, limit yourself in that fact and keep that excitement rolling for the long run. Because I have plenty of models that got excited, worked on them, and then got burnt out. And I'm done with that.
I was going to say, bouncing off what Sonar said, that is super true. But when you're new to Blender, I did teach a guy named Ace. He's a pretty cool guy, but he would hop on Blender on and off, and he didn't really stick to Blender like I hoped he would. So I would recommend you take occasional breaks, but for your first month of Blender, try and do at least an hour or two every day or every other day, just so you memorize some of the workflows. And the keybinds usually is the worst thing. I think the part where new people usually struggle is when they're starting to model, they struggle with dealing with Blender's interface just because it's so complicated and it's kind of daunting, and it's super understandable. So if you just stick to it for a certain amount of time and start remembering it, rinse and repeat. All the other stuff will become easier. And Sona was saying, look for big things. Start with what you look for, like big parts of an object, hull of a battleship, for example. Start with that stuff. And a lot of the tasks in Blender seem daunting, and you think you want to start small. A lot of beginners don't understand how difficult it is to actually model some things. So sometimes modeling something really small is actually just as hard as modeling a battleship, for example. I see people do this all the time. They're like, "Oh, I
Start
wanted to
big, go.
start exactly. Try it. Just go after that daunting task." I did the same thing, and you got to be careful. Don't aim for perfection. Try and get it as good as you can get it, but don't aim for perfection because you won't reach it. It's an impossible goal. Maybe later on you can get closer and closer to it, but as a beginner, don't. Do not.
Kind of go along with that. Keep practicing. For me, I barely have any finished artworks in Blender. A lot of what I've learned is just, hey, I wonder if I could do this, and then I mess around in Blender, and then I don't even save it. I just I've learned how to do it, and then just repeat for the next task. How do I make flour? How do I make fireworks?
It's also a really good idea if you have like a main project you're working on. An example for me is the F-16. I got bored of doing that, and I decided to go make a Mach B quote 31. It's a B-21, but for VTOL. And I was just working on that model for a while and never finished it. But it's good to just go back through the process of starting from scratch again, and you learn so much just by even making an incomplete model. You can just, it helps so much.
Doing it all again, because
Don't worry to fail.
when I was making my Hornet model, I I've been working on that for so long that I kind of forgot what it was like to make a whole new project. So I actually learned in between making the Hornet model, I'll make stuff like this. So I made a phalanx turret, and this thing, I made it just for fun. Although we could use it for our game, I was like, well, I wonder what else I can make. Because if you stay committed to one project for a really long time, it can get kind of stale in your mind because you want to make all these other things that are super neat. So you can tackle a smaller project whilst you're working on the other project. Don't feel afraid to do that. And like these guys are saying, some really good advice. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Um, I see somebody just put in the YouTube chat. I started modeling a couple days ago. How do you start with basic shapes? So here's some super basic information. If you click Shift and A, you can add objects. A mesh is considered an object. You got a whole list of things to add, preference or an add-on that is extra objects right here. So there's free add-ons that you can add to Blender. Would highly recommend doing that. How do you make the little holes in the muzzle of the Sea-Wiz? I will show you exactly how this is. So I typically avoid using a Boolean modifier. Probably used bevel and dark magic. Yes, a little bit. That's pretty fun. So typically I avoid using the Boolean modifier, but if you use it smart, you can use it pretty damn effectively. So I actually started with this. When you break it down, Blender has some pretty great modifiers that allow you to do some pretty neat stuff. Here, I'll add this in here just for example's sake. But Blender actually does a lot of the hard work if you use it right. So think smart, not hard. I actually was like, I'm going to use the mirror modifier because it's going to be identical topology on all four sides and the back. What I did here is I actually had a cylinder that I had put loop cuts in. You can see the original loop cuts were here. And then I love to use Shift and S to move my cursor to selected objects. And then I would add a cylinder, right? Or I would add a cylinder in the top here, and I'm just going to say 16, and then you size it for whatever size hole you want, and that's about good. I'm going to move my cursor in the middle, and then you change your selection of cursor up here. Whoops. And then you can rotate it like this. This is exactly how I did it. And you can just do that. If you break it down like I did, you don't have to make each one of these holes. You have to make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have to make 6 holes pretty much. So it's like super awesome if you use the modifiers properly.
Might even be able to break it down even further.
You probably could. And then for the barrels, I did use the topology on the front probably isn't nearly as good. Yeah, it's a little too complicated. I would actually go back and optimize this. But for the barrels, you can seriously start out with a cylinder. A lot of these seem very complicated. I can guarantee you that it's not. They're quite simple when you break it down. And that is how a lot of models are. So you want to break it down into its basic components. You could probably put yourself in the same shoes of the people who made the weapon itself and be like, well, how would I make a phalanx turret in real life? Well, I get some steel pipes and I put the barrel together with a special type of connector like this. And when you start breaking it down and you break down each part even more than that, I showed you with the front of the barrel, this thing, it all becomes a lot more clear as to how you would actually go upon making it. Also, another good piece of advice is you can watch time lapses. Time lapses are actually a really good tool. I don't really like watching super big tutorials where they're teaching you to make one object. I like to watch small. See, I have a good one, naval history. I would make a whole bunch of, or I would watch a whole bunch of smaller tutorials teaching me the interfaces of Blender. But then for the most part, if I'm trying to learn workflow, I would personally watch time lapse. They're actually pretty interesting. I enjoy watching time lapses. Oh, there we go. Forgot the music stopped. There we go. I enjoy watching time lapses, and they show you people who've actually made the object before and their workflow. You do have to take it with a little grain of salt. Any artist on YouTube who's using Blender, they could be just as experienced as you, or they could be more experienced. You have no idea. So take it with a grain of salt. How do you insert the barrel and extrude it down the length? So this barrel,
I think he's asking if you take it the entire length.
Let me read that again. So you insert the barrel and extrude it down the entire length. Yes, I did. So let me redo this. Making the inside of the barrel was probably one of the harder parts, so I'd increase it here. And if you look at the real thing, it kind of like flares out a little bit. I'll scale that just a tad, and I'll shade smooth it by angle. And you can bend it upwards just a tad because it's kind of how the real thing looks. And then a really neat tool that I like to use, here, I'm going to put this in the world origin. Nope, that's not where I want to put it. I'll put this in the center of the barrels. So I use a cylinder
I want to point
Yeah.
that out real quick. I find modeling real world objects really fun because it gives an opportunity to just learn about them. And most likely reason why they're flared up towards the base is to resist heat as it fires.
I think it has something to do with pressure. I'm not sure the exact mechanics. You could probably, if you hang out in the Discord, you might be able to find a dude who works on the phalanx turret. Maybe he'd tell you. That'd be super awesome. Yeah, so for this stuff, I just used this tool over here, spin tool. Very neat tool for making things such as turbines, barrels, whatever. And then you could scale this up a little bit. The real Gatling gun do not have barrels perfectly straight parallel. They're angled slight to create a spread. Yep, that is true. That's some pretty cool. I enjoy taking the time to understand why things are the way they are, especially with jets. That makes it even more enjoyable for me. Like a phalanx turret, learning that little piece of information. It's awesome. Yes, it doesn't matter for modeling, but it is a fun fact. It is a very fun fact. I would say it does matter a little bit for modeling because when you look at an image, you can see that it's not perfectly straight, like the A10 Gatling gun.
Yeah, I would say knowing why it's designed helps you model it properly and understand why it's modeled that.
Yes, right. This is probably the hardest object to make in this whole thing because if you start breaking it down in your mind with me. Okay? Let's see how this is made. This is just a curve with a depth applied to it, so you can adjust it and all that. If you break it down, it's seriously the handle's just a cylinder. Super basic. This door, just a square with a bevel modifier on it. Simple. This thing, a little more complicated. It was just a square initially, and then I used a knife tool. I put a loop cut, used a knife tool, and then I moved this face back. So we move it back, and I recreate the square. You can see it's actually just a square. Wham. It's a square. A lot of modeling stuff is how it is. Recreating this, it's just a cylinder, and I extruded these along the normals. Pretty smart tactics, I'd say, but pretty basic when you break it all down. This thing is probably a little more advanced because you're using a Boolean modifier. I wouldn't use that all the time, but I do use it occasionally. I did use it for this. The topology on this is also a little weird, but I like to use tries a lot when I can because it gives me better topology. Yeah, these don't have those because I didn't need it. This right here that mounts the cage that's on there is just some squares. This thing was a square initially, and I just scaled down the front of it, and I used the knife tool. I just cut out a couple triangles. And then I love using the loop tools bridge as well. This is also another super neat tool. This is the bridge tool. If you look at this ladder, this is also, or this step stool, or whatever this is, it's pretty damn basic. All it is I took a cube and I beveled it, and then I just messed with one of the settings really quick. Bam, there you go. It had straight and hard edges initially, but if I selected the whole loop, it allowed me to bevel it. That was it. And then for this thing, I made a couple loop cuts and extruded it, and then attached them down there. Bam. Pretty simple. This thing is seriously just a cylinder. I would be surprised if you couldn't recreate that in your mind. The whole build of the gun is just a couple cylinders. It's all pretty dang basic, and when you go back to a more complicated model, it may look more daunting because it has smaller parts. In reality, it's not. Like for this thing, you start to break it down. This is probably a little more difficult to break down because it's got smooth surfaces that curve into other objects because they are used for aerodynamics, the side of the body. But if you use your imagination, you can see how I made it. You could rethink how I made it, recreate it. It's pretty easy. Are there any more questions?
It's basically basic shape strung together to trick you into thinking it's more complicated shape.
When you start to use Blender, and you'll start to figure out that after you think with this mindset of how to recreate stuff, you're gonna go into real life and you're gonna be looking at shit and you're like, oh, that's just like a cylinder and a square with a couple quads, and that's like a couple tries right there, and you're gonna be able to recreate everything in your mind you see in real life, and you'd be thinking how you could remake that in Blender. That's a pretty neat thing. It's also like
I wonder if you take a gesture drawing course, if that could give you the right mentals to down shapes.
a gesture drawing course. I don't know what that is. Probably look it up, but I don't think you need any course to break shit down in the basic shapes. I hope all those years of kindergarten weren't wasted putting square holes, circles in the square holes, and triangles in the square hole, and the arch in the square hole. So I'm fairly confident everybody can recreate basic shapes and just slap it all together. That's how you draw. Eminem said it's exactly how you draw. It actually helped improve my drawing skills as well in my notebook. I think I'll actually pull up some pages in my notebook, but we'll keep talking here.
So do you do any material work before passing it over to the texture artist, or do you just leave that up to the texture artist?
So I always have the texture artist in mind, usually, more so than the programmer himself. I do that mainly because I think, what can I get away with, what can't I get away with? This hinge, for example, I'm thinking in my mind, oh, he's just going to model a bearing or texture a bearing on there with some silver or something, maybe make it a little shiny. So I don't have to model a whole cylinder for that. Preferably, he does not want me to make textures because it's going to end up removing them anyway. So you could use textures for just display purposes, but I wouldn't recommend using textures for...
so you could use it for guidance, but it won't be final.
Exactly, yes. I'm not the final guy for textures, although I do know how to make a little bit of a few things for texturing. I'll show you a livery that I made for VTOL VR here. I'm not the texture guy. Also, I do have a texture artist, not mainly for the reason that I can't texture, but it is because when I'm working on one project, he can be simultaneously working on another project. So I could probably make an entire game on my own, but I would prefer not to, because that's a large workload. So don't be afraid to distribute your work amongst your friends if you're working on the same project. because it's not just based on your guys' capabilities, what you can actually work with, how much work you can handle. Usually, I would also, if you're going to make deadlines, don't make deadlines when you're still learning some beginner stuff. It's a mistake that I did. If you make deadlines, you're going to screw yourself because you usually blow way past them.
You're gonna just stress yourself out for no reason.
Yep. I do like to give myself objectives that I'll get over in the day, but I'm not going to promise to anybody else that I will be finishing something. I was going to look for a model. Do you remember what I was looking for? I forgot.
Livery.
That's right. I'm a little bit of a scatterbrain. Sorry, guys. Usually I could be a little more put together, but here we go. Restraining squadron.
If you have any questions about hard modeling in general, be sure to ask. I'll pitch them up and see what we can
I would
find.
love to answer some more questions. T55 loves. Yeah, dude, this thing is awesome. Man, you seem awesome. I'm gonna send you a server. Can you have it? What, the T55? It's not mine. I didn't make this jet, by the way. Just letting you know. I made the texture though. I did not make the jet, but I did make the texture. I would never make a jet that has so many problems. I would like to remake it. That'd be interesting. This is a model from one of my favorite games called VTOL VR. It's pretty neat aircraft. You guys should definitely check that game out if you have a VR. Highly recommend. It's the same thing with texturing too. You can just break it down into simple shapes, basic principles, and you just start to remake this whole thing. Like this sun, although I didn't make it, I could easily recreate it. It's just a cylinder. You make a weird squiggly line, almost like a fire, and you just duplicate it around. Like pretty dang simple. And you have spikes. They go in between. Bam, you've already got a sun. Same design philosophies or design principles with 3D modeling. There's a lot of real life skills if you are a mechanic or do any type of stuff in that general field. It can help a lot. I'd say if you have any experience in those fields, jump head first and do a project. Maybe start with something like super, super basic. Just start like screwing with a square just to learn some of the really basic keybinds, and then just dive right into it. Go crazy. Go nuts. That's what I did with the Super Hornet. And even though it didn't look amazing, I was super proud of it and gave me a lot to work with, a lot to learn from. So I know your time is a little short here, so you can dip whatever you need to. But if you, if you have anything to add, feel free. I was trying to
pretty much hitting everything, so.
Sweet. Well, all right, I'll ask you, what was the hardest thing to work on for you when you were a beginner?
The hardest thing to work on for me is probably complicated curve and rounded shapes, like the nose of my F-16. I'm really nitpicky about kind of stuff like that, and since I'm recreating a physical model, oh my god, that one's pretty bad. You should open up the one I sent you. But basically,
how does go on?
It was the really non-natural shapes or non-blocky shapes that I had a tougher time with, but eventually learned how to kind of deal with it. But it's also to not be so nitpicky with yourself and to allow yourself some room for error. And I'm really at fault for doing that to myself. But in the intake on that was that one got me annoyed. But
a long time on this intake. I swear it took him 2 weeks to actually get it how he liked. I'd say if I were you, you could do it how he did and constantly try and get it better. But if you start just focusing on the one part and you do that shit for 2 weeks, you're going to get bored, whether you like it or not. So I would actually recommend try making other stuff of the jet better or whatever you're working on better, and then you can actually go back and fix it. I've actually done that with the Super Hornet plenty of times where I notice a problem and I go back and fix it.
Look at the engine and just show them the engine.
Here.
So that's my F-16's engine. And that whole thing was so much easier for me than the intake. Simply because the intake shape was such a specific thing and that I really wanted to nail. But the engine is, you can break it down so easily in your mind and you can see all the shapes in there. And all the engine fans are really simple, but That's my
just
What
squares.
does the nose of one of your planes, Cougar, look like?
I will show you. I see some guys.
Well, I'll get to that question after.
Yes. We'll answer your question in a moment. Guy who drew something at the Maca. We'll be there in a moment. Oh, that's the render I was using. Sorry. I have a lot. Another thing is save when you make big changes. Make an additional save. So I'll just do Control-Shift-S and I'll just change the number on this. Or you can, there's a new feature they added in Blender where you can save incremental. Super neat tool that you can use. So before I joined the fuselage and the lurkses or the wings, whatever, I made a save so I can always go back to it if I messed anything up, because there is a limit to how many controls used. But yeah, so this, the nose of this aircraft is a little weirder. The topology might be able to be improved a bit. The topology of this one's a little weird, mainly because these and this is a part of the body. For small parts like this too, this isn't actually attached to the topology itself, mainly because if you look how it's recreated IRL, it's seriously just like bolted on there. So you could take the same design concept. This was probably the most complicated part of the nose, but sorry, what did you want me to show specifically for the nose?
I was kind of curious how you pinched off the tip, but it looks like you just slowly put it into a single point.
You start to see these really weird stretch marks. They're actually more obvious inside of Blender, I think, than they are inside of...
I think that's OpenGL specifically doing that.
I have a Super Hornet model that I was given by the guys from Falcon BMS. And it's a really good model, but there's plenty of places you can improve. It was like one of his first planes that he ever made, so don't be too harsh on it. But you can see some weird shading stuff. It looks significantly better in game. So all this stuff has to do with the animation system. There's some weird shading things on the nose a little bit, and actually not too many. Just a little bit of weird shading. I was getting too nitpicky with the matte cap. You gotta be careful with that, because I was using the red velvet matte cap, trying to get everything super smooth and perfect. It's a lot more noticeable in Blender, and it's even more noticeable with this matte cap. So if you're looking at everything through this, of course it's never going to look perfect. Things look janky until you turn on something like this. Then it's more like what it would appear to be inside of the game engine. And even then it would still look better. I'd say they look better when they go into the game engine. It could just be a bit of my perspective, but you don't have to
going into that question, how would you take a box extrude and turn it into an oval shape? It looks like he's doing a trigger guard for a gun, so he wants the trigger guard to be oval.
So he's asking how I'd make an oval?
Effectively coming off of the square shape.
So for making gun models, I've seen a lot of guys who make the gun models use the bevel modifier. Get comfortable with this thing. This is called non-destructive modeling, and I would recommend that you learn how to do some non-destructive modeling. Sorry, you guys can tell me if that green keys thing isn't showing up too if you want to see the keywords, but instead of wait, bam, that's good. This thing is definitely your friend. So yeah, you can do the same thing, and you can always go back. What's awesome about this is you can always go back and fix it, and I can adjust it too. So I can adjust the weight like that. And usually when you're trying to get the right shape, you can just manually go and do that, depending on what you're trying to do. I see that, I'll pull up the image here. I see that you have used a bevel modifier already. This could interfere with some of it. So typically, that's one of the reasons why I make big saves when I make bigger changes, is you can always go back to it. Let's say I want this to be, a bevel as well.
So you're doing this through non-destructive. How did you set that up with the bevel modifier?
So all I did was I opened the modifiers tab, click on your object. You can search and add a bevel modifier. I'm using the weight option. So if you right click and use edge bevel weight, you can adjust the weight. It's a super neat tool. There we go.
You can effectively bevel the edges you want without it actually destroying the model.
Yes. exactly it. See, I'm thinking hard and not smart here. I could use whatchamacallit. Oh, I also use F2. F2 is a good one to use. It's just like fill
An
2,
add-on.
an add-on. You can use F2 to fill in objects. Oh yeah, I'm building this on the wrong axis. It's great transitioning bells from higher ready to small ready. That's a good point. I typically try and watch your how in depth your model gets when you're just watch how in depth it gets when you're making it initially. Try and start with lower amounts of topology and then slowly go up as you start to get to a more finalized version. Sonar kept falling into this on accident where he would try and make something super detailed, like his glider model. He made a glider, or the intake for the F-16 example. He would load topology, which is good. That's what you want to start with because it's easier to work with. And then he'd keep adding topology, and I'm telling him, don't do it because you're gonna have to go back and work around all of that topology. It gets in the way. It's like a roadblock. Don't be adding too much. Like the bevel.
So that's why you want the non-destructive, so you can always go back.
It's super easy to work with non-destructive. It's hard to, if you want to change topology here, dude, this is seriously just a square. You could always go back and change it. Let's say, oh, I forgot to add the site. Good thing it's low topology. I could just like, there you go, site. A lot of it's kind of workflow too.
Vent Zero showing off his crazy good typology skills there.
I don't have the cavity
that's
option
really nice.
enabled, right? I'm not sure what he means by the cavity option. I'm not sure. I don't know if it's a modifier or something. Great for transitioning bevels. Alrighty. How I made this.
I think that's in the profile of the bevel. But essentially, cavity just tells the bevel to go inward instead of outward.
Oh, oops, that's not the right one.
Pretty
I'll
sure
look
it's
for that
in
later.
profile. Maybe not.
No
I don't
idea.
know.
Like,
But yeah, it's essentially that just tells the shape to push in or out.
a whole bunch of neat stuff. Anyways, here I'll pull up this this thing. He used the bevel modifier for this, I'm pretty sure. Wow, look at that amazing curve. This is some good topology. Usually you want to look at your density and distribution too when you're modeling. A lot of newbies have bad topology and they don't know why. That's one of the main reasons. It's also, you want to be able to add loop cuts that go around your whole model too. Excuse me, adding stuff that makes it hard to work with, then you probably shouldn't add it. If you can't add loop cuts, probably shouldn't have added that. It's a visual option that makes shape in the mat cap more visible. Cavity. I don't know, I've never tried that.
Oh, see, it's doing the AO around the edges. I get it now.
Before we carry on, I'm just going to say I have to leave to go to work, but thank you for having me.
No problem. It
Awesome.
has actually been over an hour, so if you want to keep going, we can. But otherwise, I would just say if there's final questions.
Sweet. I'm down for anything you guys are down for. If you guys want to DC after and just hang out, nerd out about aircraft, I'm totally down for that. Maybe even play
Okay.
VTOL.
Yeah.
Have a good one, Summer. Peace.
Thank you so much.
But we'll probably start wrapping it up. Maybe I'll show a couple more aircraft just as we're wrapping it up. Any final questions? If so, get them out now. Worst case scenario, you can always go back and DM me. This topology is amazing too. This is a much older model. Right here, the topology is a little weird, mainly because of this. This is one of the projects I was working on that I never finished, but it was a good learning experience. I did learn a whole bunch from this. It was pretty neat. I did use like the the Boolean modifier for this one, and I could probably have distributed this out better. I'll probably want it like here. Yeah,
That's
that even looks better. This is a chopper. This is a fictional one that I was referencing. I was referencing off of a real life one called the.
I can't think of it, but I feel like it's 1960s or something.
The Australian Air Force used it. Anyways, this is one of the projects I was working on that I thought was pretty neat. You don't have to finish everything too, but I would I would usually recommend that you try and push a couple things to completion. Even easier things that you could complete. Might as well just complete it so it's something to show. And here's one of the Mavericks I made. I made a whole bunch of missiles too. Oh, that one doesn't have the seeker head because you can't see through it, I guess.
It's disabled.
It's a little hard to see this. There we go. These are just basic details that I added a long while ago. Pretty neat stuff. I was going to go back and add an AIM-9X. I was going to make an AIM-9X just for this one, just for this call, but fortunately I didn't really have time to do that. Although I do have my old one. The harm is pretty neat. I like this one. Yeah, and it's fairly low poly. If you see, I could probably distribute this better. Sweet. I'm not seeing many questions pop up here. I'll check the
So,
YouTube.
is there any final takeaways you would say you want people to understand, fundamentals or that kind of thing?
Fundamentals, I'll list them off. Keep your shit low topology so it's easy to work with. Create things with basic shapes, and get a notebook. And also get a whole bunch of different references, because references are usually not spot on all the time. That's basically what I got to say.
Yeah,
I don't think there's
I think the same when it comes to that. Blender is mostly learning the UI, but when it comes to modeling, it's extremely simple shapes, a bunch of simple shapes strung together to make a complex thing. In general, just work with it. It doesn't matter if it's for a project or not. It's just a matter of working with Blender to get to know it, and then from there you can use it to make a project.
Ooh, I got one thing that I might be able to show that you guys might like. There we go. This sounds pretty neat. Let me pause the music for it. Here. So this is actually a render that I did make. This was referenced off of the War Thunder trailer for the F-16, so it is not completely original. Here we go. I'll play it now.
There's fire in my blood.
iPhone ad, but for aircraft.
Basically,
I
that's
love
pretty
it.
funny. Cool. Well, I don't think
But on that, you said you're okay to hang out in voice chat for a little
Yeah,
while,
yeah.
and then I think that's pretty much everything we could cover on stage.
I have a whole bunch more wisdom that I could probably get into. It would probably just take half your life span to get through it all. But if you hang out with me in VC, you can learn a whole lot. There's a whole bunch of small nitty gritty things that I could get into as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much for coming and sharing what you know.
No problem. It was a pleasure. You guys are awesome. I hope to make some new friends, meet some new pretty cool people. If you check out my YouTube, you can also see I was doing physics simulation with these as well. I hope some more people joined our Discord.
I want to point it out. If you feel you have something you could share on stage, just reach out to me and we can work out a time to present and just share knowledge.
Sweet.
Other than that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the stage. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks again, Cougar. And thanks, Sonar, who hopefully is watching.
He's gotten the board.
But yeah, bye.
Have a good one. Peace. I'm going to go to voice one.